This exhibition provides a really great opportunity to reflect on the full scope of your career, starting with your earlier geometric abstraction paintings to your more recent work. Can you talk about your painting approach, whether you've always been interested in geometric abstraction, and how did you develop your interest in this mode?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that, and I may it'll involve talking a little bit about my other career as a paintings restorer, which interrupted my career as an artist. But I really can't remember a time when I wasn't painting and drawing from a very early age. And the things that most interested me as a kid were architectural landscapes, the grid of a city, the up and down of rectangular and square buildings. I really was never particularly interested in landscapes or seascapes or ponds or ducks or portraits or any of that. I really liked building blocks. And that's where that was where my focus was. When I went to college, I decided at a very early stage that I was going to become a paintings restorer. And I happened to be at a place, Ebullient College, which had an undergraduate degree that would lead to a career in paintings restoration. But the nice thing about that was that it was a Renaissance degree combining studio art, art history, and chemistry. And those were three things that interested me tremendously. So I kept painting throughout my undergraduate career. At Ebullient, there were some excellent artists on the faculty. There were 4 faculty members. All of them tended to work in grids. At that point in time, this was the early 1970s, and I was influenced by that. Naturally, I had an affinity towards it because of my natural affinity towards architectural landscapes. And I started working on grids and using the underlying grid as a way to create a geometric composition. And that's what these early pictures do. It was really an exploration of those ideas. And then I decided to become a paintings restorer, or I became a paintings restorer by moving to New York and doing graduate work at NYU and then beginning to work at the Metropolitan Museum. And I had to give up doing my own work for a variety of reasons. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 other people, so there was no place to do the work. But also as a graduate student, I was working 13, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it just wasn't possible to do my own work. And then when I first interviewed at the Met, I took a portfolio of my own paintings as well as my academic background. And the man that I was hoping to study with and to be trained by, who became my mentor, told me that I had to make a choice, that I could either be an artist or I could be a paintings restorer, but I could not do both because it was not possible to marry those 2 things together. And I wasn't real clear as to why he thought that at the time. I'm more clear now, and we can return to that at some point. But I wanted to be a paintings restorer, and I didn't have the time to be an artist, so I just stopped doing my own work completely. And I thought in the back of my mind that I might want to return to it at some point, or that I might get the urge. And about 40 years later, I did get the urge. And I was working at the Getty at the time, and for some unknown reason just got the urge to start doing some of my own work again, and began to do that, but immediately returned to the idea of having an underlying grid to build a composition upon. And that has been a consistent thread between the early work and the work that I'm doing now. And I like that building structure, that framework that allows you to then develop the composition on top.
That's a really good segue, because when I think of building the grid, I think of blocking out perspective lines, the Renaissance way of designing a composition. And so in the newest catenary curves piece from 2025, there's a few really interesting allusions or references to Renaissance forms of composition. There's the arch form, which is the architectural form, sort of the idea of an entrance into the painting. But then there's also this darker brown sort of band at the bottom of the painting. And so in a lot of Renaissance portraits, you have kind of the subject of the painting is leaning or behind this band, whether it's meant to look like wood or it's this separation of the pictorial space from the viewer space. But then you also have that central twisting gray form in front of that ledge space. So there's this really interesting playing with Renaissance compositional elements. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in this most
you know,
recent work.
I keep looking at the painting itself right over there, so it kind of remind me about what I was thinking about. Let's backtrack a little bit and just talk about the catenary curve itself.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, a catenary curve is the curve that you get when you take a chain and hang it between 2 points. I was inspired to start working with that shape for 2 reasons. I went to the Jasper Johns exhibition at the Whitney a number of years ago, and there were some of his, he did a whole series of catenary curves, not as paintings, but he would actually pin a piece of string to his compositions, and he would get a catenary curve that would link the disparate parts of the composition together. And I loved that aspect of linkage, and that's what a catenary curve does. It really ties one spot to another, but also then defines the space that's in between those 2 spots where the anchors occur. And I think the same year I went to St. Louis, where I had never been, and there's of course the famous St. Louis Arch, which is an upside down catenary curve of sorts. It's really a parabola, but if you turned it upside down as a chain and hung it, that's the shape that you would get. There's something timeless about that shape, and no matter how tight or how broad it is, it's so lyrical and it's so rhythmic in the way that it defines a space. And I was drawn to it, and I just thought I always liked, I think the most successful works of art have a timeless quality or an inevitability about them, and catenary curves are inevitable shapes because they just happen because of gravity. You know, that happen not because we make them look the way they do, but because nature makes them look the way that they do.
We'll come back to that point later.
Okay. So at any rate, that's the underlying thought of the whole series of pictures. In terms of the spatial way, and this particular painting, the most recent one, the spatial way that things are constructed, I think I have a subconscious need to create a Renaissance space because it is balanced and perfect. But I also like to throw something into it which adds some tension. So the space in all of my paintings has natural references, but at the same time I hope makes you a little bit uncomfortable because it's, you know, it is spatial, but oh no, wait a minute, it doesn't quite work and I can't quite be a part of it, or I can get invited to a certain point of it and then I have to enter another world that's a little bit different than the world that I live in. And that's what I was trying to do with this particular picture, was set up a sense of landscape with that brown line at the bottom, or architectural foundation, but then throw you off a little bit by trying to put a piece of it almost in our world. So there's that tension between the world that we're in and the world that we're looking at in the picture that we're going to try and get into.
And then when it comes to sort of understanding or interpreting that work, I think you've mentioned that this catenary curve is a portrait of someone.
Right.
So it's a really abstract portrait, and you know, maybe a portrait is supposed to be a way that you can see someone or get an understanding of maybe who someone is, but it's in this painting, it's completely abstract. So you have that little bit of tension as well, where it's a painting that's a portrait, but you wouldn't know it's a portrait.
Right.
But then you have these compositional elements from the Renaissance that say, oh, maybe there is an element of portraiture here, but then, you know, it is blurring this line between the pictorial space and the viewer space by having that gray twisted form in front of the distancing ledge.
Right. That's true. Yeah. In all of my work, and this you know, applies to the most recent stuff, but also the earlier stuff and the very early stuff. I'm interested in geometric abstraction because I'm drawn to that as a visual and compositional effect. But I didn't just want them to be decorative or on the surface. I wanted there to be an underlying meaning, an underlying motivation behind creating that composition or using those geometric shapes. And with the catenary curves, portraiture seemed to be the right way to go about it because of just sort of human linkages. And it was a natural way to incorporate some underlying meaning, to infuse what was eventually a geometric abstraction with some meaning and some weight. And it doesn't necessarily have to be obvious. When I title the picture, you know, it's catenary curves, whatever number in the series, but in parentheses, a portrait of, in the person's initials, so that when the viewer's looking at it, they go, oh, this is more than just a series of nice curving shapes. There's some underlying depth to it.
So going back to the catenary curve motif, one thing that I was really thought was interesting in how it differentiates this body of work from earlier bodies of work is that a lot of the works that, not necessarily this one, but the still life works, they seem to sort of exist in an unreal space. Even though there is that blue of that could be a sky, it's not necessarily obviously a three-dimensional object. It could be, it's a sort of fantastical space, but as you mentioned, the catenary curve implies Earth gravity, right? So what spurred this change from creating unreal spaces into a space that could only be, an Earth gravity?
Well, I think what I hope is that both spaces are there, that there is this surreal space that doesn't really exist but makes a reference to the real space that we're in. The catenary curves that are in their proper position, coming from with the end of the curve at the bottom, and I'm actually looking at another one in the series with the orb in the middle. There's a kind of cradling that takes place there, and that's again a human aspect. It's protective, and I liked the fact that it's a protective shape and it's cradling this orb, which is kind of a mysterious object, within a difficult space. And there's a kind of play between safety and refuge, and then, well, but I'm in a place of infinite expansion. There's a tension there, or I hope there's a tension there, which should be a little unsettling, but reassuring at the same time. So you're vulnerable, but you're protected because of the elements of the composition.
That is definitely something that I've observed, that there's a very surreal element in some of these works, that they're very unreal, and that tension is very much there. They're not scary, but they are a little unsettling.
Good.
So we are sitting in front of the one of the Constable cloud study inspired paintings. So you have this twisted gray rope looking form that is a reference. I watched your Yale video to the way that the clouds are sort of scrolling across the sky.
Right.
But then this motif does appear in the 2025 catenary curves, as well as in some other places. So could you talk about what this motif means, here versus in non-Constable related works?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it started, just to backtrack again a little bit. It started out with the Constables, where I needed to come up with a geometric and visual motif that reflected upon the movement of the clouds in Constable's studies. And when you read Constable's writings, he talks a little bit about the locomotion of the clouds. They come in horizontal lines and they move in a kind of tumbling locomotive effect. And one of the first things that you learn in art school is how to draw a rope. And you learn how to do it by drawing that rope on a grid. So it had a natural appeal to what I like to do, which is to work on a grid, and you make these points on the grid and you link them, and you have a vertical and horizontal grid, but you get this incredibly fluid moving shape by drawing a rope on that. And that's what it was originally. In the smaller one-to-one cloud studies that I did, the people at Yale asked me to do a couple of larger landscapes, which were not necessarily based upon a specific Constable landscape, and that's what this one is, where I took the clouds and sort of made them my own. I kept the orbs there, which were reflective of 19th century German Romantic painting that was going on at the same time that Constable's working. He didn't know these artists, and these artists didn't know him. They may have known each other, but they had no interest in each other. But I liked that combination of the slightly mystical orbs with the very lyrical and natural landscapes of Constable. There's also a sense of 17th century Dutch landscape painting with this white horizon line. If you think of artists like Philips Koninck, he always has a white horizon, so that gives you a real sense of space. The landscape below, I was frankly not sure what I was going to do when I was asked to do larger landscapes. And flying back, I was living in Dallas at the time, and flying back from New York to Dallas, we flew over a big area of farmland. And of course, farm fields are set out as a grid. I thought, oh, well, that's perfect. It fits my love for grids, but also the aerial perspective that you get in a farmland works very well. So that's where all of those elements came from, and I tried to put them all together to make what I hope is also a slightly unsettling landscape. Surreal, yes, it's not really influenced by surrealists, but it has that slightly disconcerting, slightly mystical look while still referencing very natural occurrences. So what I've done by then taking that rope motif, to get back to your original question, I sort of feel like I can borrow from whatever I want in my own work. And I like the fact that the rope has a sense of motion, also has a sense of sexuality, and that's what I'm using it for, or used it for in the catenary curve portraits. It's a sense of movement, impact, force, that's what I hope that kind of movement conveys. And the same thing I've done with the grids that appear in a couple of those pictures, is to give the curves a framework to hang upon, to give them an anchor, so that you're in a space, it's anchored, you're in a place, but then that grid continues forever. It goes out all sides of the composition.
Like in the weavings works that you've done, those go on forever as well.
And that's influenced by Mondrian, an artist that I know well and always loved. And he does talk about the infinite in relation to his compositions, because they're not simply contained in that space, but they really do. He intends them to go on forever. And you're getting a glimpse, a sliver of the infinite space that he's referring to.
Are any of the works in this show based on specific Old Master works? I know that in the past you've done works that are interpretations of Jacques-Louis David. So we have the mythological element. We have the Prometheus one that's behind me.
Right.
So is that, or are any of these based on specific Old Master referent?
Yes. I'd like to say actually all of them, not specifically, but because of the work that I did with Old Master paintings for so many years, and that relationship that I developed with them, it's just part of my natural thought process. And I like referring to the mythological subjects that Old Master artists worked with. The two pictures that you mentioned that are in the show here, the Prometheus and the Semele. The Semele is specifically related to a 17th century French painting by an artist named Blanchard, which I restored when I was living and working in Dallas. It belonged to a private collector, and it was subsequently donated to the Dallas Museum of Art. And to explain the story, Semele was a mortal, but she was having an affair with the king of the gods, Zeus. And the rules were that the gods could not appear in their own form to humans, or the human would be destroyed. And so Zeus would come to her in the form of an eagle, which was his attribute. And that's how they had their affair. But Zeus's wife became very jealous, and she was a friend of Semele's, and she convinced Semele that it would be okay for her to ask Zeus to appear in his natural form. And she convinced him to do that, and when he did that, she was consumed by fire. And that's what underlies the myth. And that was the picture that I restored, was a very large composition showing Zeus transforming from an eagle into his godlike appearance, and Semele literally bursting into the flames on the bed that she was lying on. So yeah, it's a great picture. It's a great story too.
Did she have children?
She was pregnant at the time, and what Zeus did was to take the fetus, implant it in his thigh, and after the gestation period was over, the baby was born, and it became Bacchus, the god of wine.
Okay, I couldn't remember which.
The stories are all interconnected, and it goes on and on. But
which animal is he appearing
exactly,
as? Which woman is it? Which children is it? Is it a swan?
Exactly.
Is it a shower of gold?
In this case, it was an eagle, and that's how the myth led to the birth of Bacchus.
Who then gets to join the pantheon.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, so the little Semele study is specifically a result of thinking about the Blanchard, which was a very moving and powerful picture, despite the ridiculousness of the myth, but still there's such underlying human reality to it about love and sex and how all of those things influence our everyday lives. So that's, yes, the original question was, are they referencing old master paintings? And definitely. And again, that gives what is essentially, in the end, a geometric abstract composition. It gives it an underlying meaning and a foundation. Doesn't mean that that's all that's going on there. And hopefully, people will bring their own perspective to it and see other things in it. It's really about interaction and reaction and consequences for your actions, which is what that myth is all about. Same with the Prometheus. The Prometheus is not reflective of a specific painting. It's more the idea Prometheus stole fire from the gods and was punished by it by being chained to a rock and having his internal organs eaten by an eagle every day. And then they would heal and the eagle would come back and do it. So that picture is more about fire, and that's why it has this fire background. The orbs are really the mystical implications of mythology and our relationship to whatever gods we have in our lives. And then the grid is really what holds all of it together. And Prometheus is bound to that grid in a way that we are too, despite all the chaos that takes place behind it.
But also, you have the repetitive form of the orb, and sort of that repetitive every day is getting his liver eaten by the eagle. And then also the grid is eternity, because it was an eternal punishment. Exactly.
And the reason they're green and blue is because it again was the conflict between the mythological and surreal and spiritual aspect of the myth itself and the reality of human earthly existence. And there's nothing more real than green grass and blue skies.
So one of the works we have in this show, Toccata and Fugue, references classical music. Can you talk about the connection between music and your work?
Yeah, again, there's a nice grid. I was a musician. I learned how to play the piano, and and then I tried to play the trumpet, but it was really miserable. But I come from a musical family, and I was surrounded by that all the time. And music is written on a series of straight lines with vertical and horizontal grid patterns, and that's how you get the rhythm and flow of music. So it was a very easy transition to take the page of music and then combine it with the sounds and the rhythm and the effects that you get orally, and just reinterpret that visually. The toccata and fugue is inspired by the rhythm of a toccata and fugue, and how in a fugue there's a simple melody which is then repeated over and over and over again on top of itself, and that's what that picture is all about, and references that kind of movement. And in fact, it was something that I thought about back in the and I'm looking at the two paintings right here. I thought about it in the 1970s, and that's what the vertical pictures are about, with the repetitive, rhythmic movement of music interpreted in a visual way.
Are there specific musicians that you were listening to, or?
Well, yes and no. My dad was a timpanist, and so percussion is not a terribly melodic. There is melody, and in fact, a timpani can play a broader range of melodic notes than a piano can. But percussionists are most interested in rhythm, and so that inspiration of the percussive foundations for music, the percussive foundations that are used in a symphony orchestra, for example. You get a melodic line with the violins and the cellos and the flutes and the brass, but there's a grid-like foundation with the percussive, repetitive, rhythmic aspect that underlies the music.
Other thoughts that you have for people who are coming to see the show?
The only thing that I haven't really talked about, and there aren't too many grid patterns actually here. Maybe two things. Let me just talk a little bit about the weavings and how those were developed. And when I retired from my work as a painter's restorer at the Getty, and I went back to move to Palm Springs, set up my studio, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? And my first thoughts were, well, I do want to make pictures that are geometric and abstract in their compositional elements, but to have this underlying meaning. I just thought, I sat quietly, actually for not very long, in the studio and thought about, well, how about love and loss and how those two things are interrelated. It's not a unique, it's not my idea, but we all have experienced love in our lives. And if you're going to let love come into your life, you're going to have loss. And it's absolutely inevitable. For me, it was reflective of the AIDS crisis, which I lived through, and I lost my partner at the time during that crisis period. And there's something universal and very human about that. And because those two things, love and loss, are woven together. And so, there's the compositional basis. We're going to do weavings, or I'm going to do weavings based on how those two things relate to one another. So that was the inspiration there. And then that continued to evolve, and I just sort of thought about, as I have with all of the series that I've done, what is a kind of universal truth that can also then be reflected in a compositional element. And that's where the still life paintings come from. I spent a lot of time as a paintings restorer working on Dutch 17th century still life paintings. And they are all about not necessarily love and loss, but life and death. The fleeting nature of life and the fleeting nature of the vanitas and all of that. And that's a very powerful concept and something that we all face, because we're all going to die eventually. And I liked that idea of taking still life elements and the underlying sense of the tension between life and death and working it into a geometric shape and a geometric composition.
Because when you paint something, it's going to, it becomes immortal.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.